Meeting has begun.
That was loud. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Kathryn Magura. I'm the Assistant Director for Operations at Oregon State University and also the Northwest ACUHO President.
And I'm Josh Gana, Assistant Director for Facilities and Operations at University of Washington and a former Northwest ACUHO President.
And we put together this presentation actually for ACUHO-I back in June on behalf of the ACUHO-I Public Policy Committee, and we're asked if we could kind of step in and take on this presentation today after we had a cancellation for the first Friday webinar. So thank you very much for joining us today. So who are we? So Josh and I have known each other actually back from when he worked down here at Oregon State University. We worked together and have been friends since then as well through our Northwest ACUHO connections and otherwise. This picture here on this slide is actually the two of us at the Edmonton Northwest ACUHO conference just about 2 years ago now. And we are here to talk about the service and assistance animal policies that we have seen on our campuses, that we have seen others do, and just give you some tips, some best practices, and a bit of the legal aspect as well. All of that said, we would love to know a little bit more about what you would hope to learn today, just to make sure that we are covering everything.
Yeah, and so I would say if you have anything in specific that you're looking for today, go ahead and put it into the chat box and we'll make sure to cover that at some point.
And as we get started here, I just want to give a little bit of a caveat. This is an extremely complex topic. I know I've had personally quite a bit of experience on my campus, but I don't know that I would be comfortable calling myself an expert at this point. And we only have probably about 50 minutes or so to really go through all of the information. And so with that, we will give a comprehensive perspective on the whole situation, but not necessarily answer every single question that we know is out there. And then, of course, neither Josh nor myself are lawyers. We both are fans of using some legal terms, and I know I personally watch a lot of legal TV shows, but by no means are we lawyers. So just keep that in mind. And then again, as a bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about during this session today, we're going to start with the policy landscape. So what laws are out there currently? What are some of the implications there? We're going to make sure that we've got some clear definitions of terms because that's important. And again, that goes back to that legal perspective. We're also going to talk about some of the compliance tools, so how to help you potentially come up with a good policy for your own campus and look and see how colleagues across the United States are putting this together. And then finally, some Q&A. So we want to make sure that we have enough time to cover all of that.
Great. So when we're talking about kind of the legal landscape that's associated with this issue, you've got laws that kind of serve as your baseline condition, but then a significant amount of interpretation when it comes to actual case law and precedent set. And we're going to talk a little bit about both, but they're both important and different. It's really critical to understand that it's an evolving landscape, and day-to-day, case-by-case, it's kind of changing where we sit. But to take a step back, when we look at the U.S. and talk about service and assistance animals, there's really kind of three areas of law that address that. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, Section 504 of the Rehab Act, which is kind of tied into the ADA piece, and then the Fair Housing Act. And all three are different, but inform different areas of the animal conversation. In Canada, it's heavily a provincial law-based thing. They do have versions of ADA and Fair Housing Act, but they're slightly different depending on where in Canada you're looking at. The Fair Housing Act is a housing and urban development U.S. government law, and it is one of the most significant areas of changing, evolving law that I've experienced in this industry in the last 10 years. If you think back, for those of us that were in the field 10 or 15 years ago, nobody really talked about the FHA. It was an assumption that academic institutions had what was called academic deference, and it was housing incidental to the academic process and not a landlord-tenant relationship. Therefore, the Fair Housing Act wasn't necessarily applied to higher education. Now, through a number of precedents, it's clear that that's no longer the case, and if an institution isn't paying attention to the Fair Housing Act, you're potentially putting yourself up to some risk and exposure there. Fair Housing Act at its core is a civil rights law. It's not an accessibility law specifically. It's essentially banning discrimination of all types in housing. And part of that is making sure that that housing environment can accommodate assistance animals in that dwelling environment. So that's kind of your baseline of the Fair Housing Act. What it says is it is unlawful to discriminate against any person in the terms, conditions, or privileges of sale or rental of a dwelling, or in the provision of services or facilities in connection with that dwelling because of a handicap. So again, you think back to civil rights, and disability is one aspect of open access, and that's where it ties the Fair Housing Act back into what we're talking about today. We'll get to it also in a couple minutes, but not only terms and conditions here, but the other really relevant aspect of the Fair Housing Act is provision of services. And that's something that in our environment can mean living learning programs, room types, dining facilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The American with Disabilities Act, on the other hand, is under the auspices of the U.S. Department of Justice, and it has two different chapters of it that are relevant in the higher ed environment. And I really just show you this to show that pretty much any type of educational environment needs to abide by the ADA. Title II applies to governmental entities, so your state schools get wrapped up in that piece. Title III is businesses, nonprofits, public accommodations, and education. So whether you're public, private, large, small, religious, non-religious, both of these kind of work together to make sure that we all need to abide by the ADA. The American with Disabilities Act, or ADA, is more of an access-driven policy. And what it essentially states is that an institution needs to modify policies, practices, and procedures to accommodate access for individuals with disabilities. It is disability focused as a body of law, and where it gets you at the end of the day is that in an area of public accommodation, service animals are required. And that's kind of, again, where we come in. As we look to the language in Section 504, may not impose upon handicapped students other rules, such as the prohibition of dog guides in campus buildings. So that's kind of where we're getting at with this animal piece. To kind of look to a blow-by-blow comparison, which I actually find really helpful, as you look, to the ADA, again, it's access to public accommodations versus Fair Housing Act is a civil rights in housing law. So public accommodations broad, Fair Housing Act, housing specific. ADA applies to government, public accommodations, education. Fair Housing Act is, again, most housing environments. Where we get to the big animal difference is what these two bodies of law require. The ADA specifically denotes service animals, which have a specific legal definition we'll get to, whereas your Fair Housing Act says reasonable accommodations, which could include assistance and emotional support animals. Now, that's the area that does not have a specific legal definition, and one that we see as we look at the landscape across the country, quite a bit of interpretation and misunderstanding about what that comes to. And then again, where are those animals allowed under the ADA? It's all areas of public accommodation, which on a college campus is most areas, whereas the Fair Housing Act is limited to that animal in a dwelling environment, but also that includes public and common use areas. So that's one of the big hot topics now is, do I need to allow that assistance animal into the hall lounge or the lobby or the kitchen? The prudent conservative approach at this point is anything that's kind of within the footprint under the same roof of that building is pretty commonly accepted as that public common use area. It also, in some environments, is being extended if you've got one regional dining center and that dining plan is required for a student living on campus. All of a sudden, that dining center becomes part of the housing services, programs and services, and there are some schools that are now allowing those assistance animals in dining centers too. So we'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. So we look to these two bodies of law. We've used a couple words, and I just want to be kind of clear about the difference between accessibility and accommodation. The notion of accessibility is you've created an environment that's free from barriers as a baseline condition. And so before any particular individual with any particular need walks through your door, you've maximized that environment to be as accessible as possible. And so you think of notions like universal design. It's usable by everybody. It's got certain baseline conditions. The accommodation side, on the other hand, is something that happens after the fact. It's looking at an individual case situation. It's an adaptation that can't be anticipated or standardized, and it's different for each student that we encounter in each request. And so where this kind of applies is as we talk to the ADA, which is an accessibility-driven law that says that, you know, you've got to create this accessible environment. Service animals are kind of an automatic accessibility feature, service dogs. And so there isn't necessarily a pre-approval process that comes with that. Whereas on the accommodation side, the Fair Housing Act, this emotional support animal concept is one that is an accommodation. And so you're looking at a specific case saying this animal makes sense in this case, and we're going to make a modification. We're going to use these words kind of throughout our presentation. So what's our obligation as a housing provider, no matter what your institution is? It's essentially, no matter which body of law you're looking at, we need to provide comparable, convenient, and accessible housing at the same cost to a student that has the need for a service or assistance animal as any other student in our environment. We are obligated to make reasonable modifications to our policies, practices, or procedures to avoid discrimination, and specifically discrimination to individuals with disabilities. And it is an individualized assessment. And so where you see some schools running into trouble are those that set some blanket policy that says no this, this, or this ever without taking kind of that case-by-case approach. Now, I'm making a very black and white statement when I say that, and there's always nuance to it. But when you talk about disability law and good practices, it is looking at that individual case-by-case and applying your broader context to that. So it's important to keep in mind. Okay, so as we're kind of narrowing in on the animal side of this conversation, again, there's a significant difference between a service animal, again, which is under the ADA, and an assistance or emotional support or therapy animal, which falls under the Fair Housing Act. The service animal has a very specific definition, and it's a dog that's individually trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability, including physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or other mental disability. There is a nuance for some miniature horses, which I'll get into on the next slide, but specifically this dog or a miniature pony needs to be explicitly trained to serve and fulfill a major life function for an individual. And so service animals are well trained, they're usually well identified, it's a pretty well established process. For a service animal, you must grant access to handlers and public accommodations. So an individual with a service dog could walk onto our campus today, not be required to provide any pre-notice, and we would have an obligation to support that dog. The exceptions, exclusions, are service animals cannot be any animal besides a dog, and then there's this new little nuance in the law that allows for a miniature pony. I'm not sure I've heard of any miniature ponies in housing yet, but I could anticipate that might come up. A service animal is not a crime deterrent animal, and it's not an emotional support, comfort, or companionship animal. That's the different nuance that we talk about.
Josh, just really quick about the service animal. One reason for the miniature ponies is they live longer, and in some cultures, dogs are considered dirty. So you'll see sometimes often Muslim countries, that's where you'll see the miniature horses. So just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. Thanks, Kathryn. Assistance animals on the other side, and we use the word assistance animal in this presentation, but you'll hear them called comfort animals, therapy animals, emotional support animals. There's not a real common vernacular associated with this. But the notion is broader in range, and it's necessary in the home environment to assist with emotional support. And the other token to that is that there aren't any breed or type restrictions associated with assistance animals, and there's no specific requirement for training. It's healthcare provider essentially documenting that that animal provides support in some way to an individual, and then there isn't a lot that's set beyond then, and that's where that individual case assessment comes in. Now, again, everything's not black and white, so I say there's no breed restrictions, but of course, if you live in an area that has illegal animals, like here, you can't have cougars at home. We would not allow a cougar as an assistance animal. And I think Kathryn's going to probably talk about this later, but you also get into some interesting dynamics as you're working with roommates and comfort level there, so that's acknowledge that. But an assistance animal can be a reasonable accommodation in a dwelling if that person has a disability. You've got a healthcare provider saying that that animal is necessary to afford equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling, and then there's an identifiable relationship or nexus between the disability and the assistance that animal provides. And so you will likely see requests from all kinds of healthcare providers, and depending on what the disability is, that may come from a different type of provider. Some are physicians, some are psychiatrists or counselors or psychologists, and that's where that individual assessment comes in of identifying, okay, is the disability a disability? Does this animal provide equal opportunity? And is there a relationship between those two? What they look in kind of this blow by blow in terms of rights, again, a service animal, we have to presume that service animal is entitled to be on site. We here at the University of Washington have a certain timeline where we request individuals request accommodations from us. What I need to keep in mind when we look at that is that a service animal is not an accommodation. A service animal is a baseline accessibility right, and so if they show up with a service dog, they show up with a service dog and we house that service dog. It's certainly nice to know in advance and we request that, but it is not required. An assistance animal, on the other token, again, this is under your Fair Housing Act hat, is treated as an accommodation request, and so there can be pre-notice requirements to that. It's not the baseline standard condition. Somebody needs to ask for that accommodation and be granted it before showing up with their sugar glider, boa constrictor, rat, turtle, or other kitty cat animal that's not a service animal. There are also different verification requirements and rights associated with that. So on the service animal side, again, dogs or miniature ponies, all that we can ask as an institution is that animal a service animal, and what that task is that animal performing? Those that work in assignments and disability support services are really well versed in that. But what we've found is we've needed to go back and do some significant work with our frontline service staff in the dining centers and our desks and otherwise to make sure that they're in tune with this aspect of the requirement. So, you can't get into details and ask for, papers or documentation on a service animal. It's really, is this a service animal? If the answer is yes, what task is it performing for you? You get the answer and that's a done deal. If the answer is no, it's not a service animal, then you can apply whatever animal restrictions you have in that particular environment. The assistance animal side of things, what we look for in granting that accommodation is there sufficient documentation that establishes that animal is necessary, there's an existence of a disability, and there's a nexus between the two, the animal and the disability. The animal helps the disability. So we look to exclusion, so when can you say no? With a service animal, only under a couple conditions. One is that animal out of control? And I think the specific language is out of the immediate control of the handler. Two, if it's not housebroken, that's an acceptable exclusion. And then the third is if it's creating a direct, specific threat to others in that environment. That's not a general threat, and so if a service animal scares somebody, that's not a threat, but if it's actually making threatening behavior, that's a different story. The assistance animal, you have, as an institution, a fair amount of latitude of where that assistance animal can go. Remember, this is a housing law, Fair Housing Act, and so it's really housing environment specific. So most often, universities will exclude assistance animals in academic buildings, for instance. As I mentioned, though, you've got to be kind of careful in your environment to think about what is that dwelling unit, what's connected to it. So again, if you've got a dining center that's the only dining center, and students have to have a dining plan, one could make the reasonable jump that if that student needs that animal to enjoy the housing environment, they may be able to take it into that dining center. There have been some recent guidance given by the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education that suggest that universities should consider classroom requests for emotional support animals as an accommodation. And so that's just something to pay attention to. That wouldn't necessarily be under the auspices of the Fair Housing Act, but it's more of a Department of Education thing. And so that's an evolving area. And then kind of, again, just explicitly service animal, anywhere, assistance animal, dwelling, and associated public areas. Just to give you a couple things to look at if you're kind of a legal geek like we are, we've gone over the language in the laws up till this point, and then a lot of it gets applied in case precedent. And this is something that if you're facing a particular decision, you may want to engage your legal counsel to look at what the recent case law says, because that starts to inform what the best practice is. U.S. versus Milligan was a settled case, but it essentially established that university housing must be provided to persons with disabilities in a non-discriminatory manner. You combine that with the Kearney judicial ruling, which basically said the Fair Housing Act applies to university housing. And those are really the watershed moments where universities started accepting that even though a lot of us don't operate in a landlord-tenant relationship, the Fair Housing Act is a civil rights law. It's not a landlord-tenant law, and you start needing to think about these things. Portland State University case was settled, but it established that institutions have an obligation to provide equal access to services and room types. And so in this case, it was a service animal that got assigned to a room that didn't have carpet, and they restricted that animal from being in carpeted areas. And the settlement came back and basically said, no, you can't force accommodations into one particular housing type. That also, again, if you've got a living learning program that is only in one facility, you need to make sure that facility is accessible for students. And then the Grand Valley State University case was settled as well, and it established that emotional support animals could be in common areas of dwellings, so lounges, kitchens, lobbies, things that are part and parcel with that residential environment. With that, I have certainly talked your ear off here. I'm going to turn it over to Kathryn, and again, a reminder, if you've got any questions that come up, go ahead and use that chat box, and we'll make sure to address them.
Thanks, Josh. Going back just really quickly to some of those court cases, so a couple things that are of note moving forward, especially for those of us in the States. With the Portland State case, and I don't know if anyone here on the call is from Portland State, feel free to add content if you are, but essentially the Department of Justice and Department of Education came in and rewrote their policies for service and assistance animals after that hearing came through, that ruling came through. And so if you think about your ability on your campus to work with the parties who must be involved in the conversation in your general counsel's office to develop a good policy, it's challenging when you have two different government agencies coming in and telling you what should be in your policy. So with Portland State as an example, that's where it became part of the process where the dining center was looked at as being part of the dwelling. When that happened, because I'm here at Oregon State, just about an hour and a half south of Portland State, that immediately triggered some questions on our campus of, well, that's not particularly good. We were able to talk to our general counsel about the fact that we have specific health code laws and policies that would be affected and implicated if we were to allow these assistance animals that are untrained to be in our dining centers. So luckily, at this point, our general counsel's office agrees with us and says, we're fine supporting you and not allowing these assistance animals in that dining dwelling. And then really quickly with the Grand Valley State case, part of the challenge there, and going back to something Josh had said in regards to training of all of your staff, is that case was initially triggered in part due to some language used by, I think, a student who was working at the front desk staff situation. So someone who answers the main housing phone misspoke in regards to a service versus assistance animal, and that kind of unraveled that whole case. So making sure that your staff at all levels know how to answer some of the basic questions regarding these animals is going to be very helpful. So with that, I have some examples here of particular policies that I have. I have my own from Oregon State University, some colleagues at Texas Tech University, and then the University of Florida. I have not been able to come up with any good policies from our Canadian partners. So if anyone knows of any good policies or how animals are allowed or defined on campuses up in Canada, I would love to know more about that. But at this point, the examples that I have are from the states themselves. I'm not going to be able to go through these links at this point, but we will provide them after the webinar as well if you want to know more information. But some specifics and some points that kind of are clear and help create a very good policy, some themes that I have seen as I've done my research are, there's kind of three things that go into a really good policy for assistance and service animals on your campus. The first is the policy needs to be clearly defined and related to the laws. So as Josh has talked about, we need to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act. We need to talk about the Fair Housing Act and the Rehabilitation Act. So there's things like that where it's very clear what it is we're doing, why this policy is in existence, and in response to what. You also need to clarify what animals can be approved. Service and miniature horses that are service animals, that's a done deal. For the most part, in my experience, I've been lucky. I've known about service animals coming into my halls because there's been other accommodation requests made by a student. So usually students with service animals have another disability that's going to need some sort of accommodation, and then that's where I usually find out that they've got a service animal. I've yet to be surprised by that, but I'm also prepared for that surprise. And then the last thing here is that the policy needs to outline the process by which a student can be successful in navigating. And that's something that I really want to clarify for you, because I've seen some other policies out there that make a student go from office X to Y to Z all the way back to A, B, and C. And it's if you don't fill your form out in the right order and then get it submitted by the third full moon of the season, you're not going to get approved. And that doesn't help anyone. If you make your process so cumbersome, a student can't navigate it successfully. You know, I don't want to get into the heads of my colleagues at other institutions or know what's going on in their cultures, but in conversations that I've had at various events and conferences, a lot of people try to create a process that's so hard to navigate that it makes it nearly impossible for a student to get that animal approved. And while, yes, on one hand, that solves some of your problems about having potential residence halls become zoos, that doesn't help that student who has that disability in which they need that animal succeed in their environment. So it's really important to keep that student focus in mind, which for the most part we do in other aspects of the work we do day to day. Why wouldn't that also extend to students who are requesting animals due to a disability? So similar to what Josh was saying, it's nice to kind of have these two compared next to each other in terms of what that request process looks like. How do you get it verified? What does the assignment process look like? And then other considerations that come into play. So again, with service animals, they're not required to tell us that they're bringing that. Again, from my experience, for the most part, I've been informed of that when students are also making other accommodation requests. For an assistance animal, the part of the accommodation request in and of itself is to have that animal. So oftentimes I will say a student who has anxiety or depression. Those tend to be two of the biggest ones where students are requesting to have an assistance animal. So they'll say that they've got one of those, and a part of their accommodation is they have this animal that helps them with that disability or mitigate some of the issues that come up from that disability in these ways. For verification, again, for service animals, you cannot require verification of the animal. I still hear people talking about how you can ask for the papers that show that it's a registered service animal. No, you cannot. You can't even require it to wear a vest that says it's a service animal. I know that when I'm meeting with students who have a service dog, I do talk about the service vest. I have a student who has a dog right now who at first didn't have a vest on it, and she was continually getting stopped everywhere on campus saying, no dogs allowed, you can't have this dog. And she came to my office and was just really frustrated that she kept getting questions. And I told her, one of the ways that she can help mitigate that is by getting a vest and showing that it is a service dog. She'll still get some questions, but that will kind of take some of those baseline questions away. And then with an assistance animal, the verification process really is specific. The process by which a student can get an assistance animal approved on our campus is actually pretty lengthy. They need to go to a certified medical professional and prove through that professional that that animal is necessary due to the existence of a disability. And again, that nexus between the animal and the disability is important. So as an example, this year I have a student with a python on campus. And yes, that's a python. I've learned a lot about pythons in the last few months. This one is a smaller one, which makes it less likely to cause harm. It was still something we took great pause about. But one of the reasons that this animal is helpful for the student is that there's the routine of care for the animal, the petting it, stroking it. I guess it helps ameliorate some of those issues. And so it's important for the people who are working on the housing side of things to really remove themselves from the situation, because my immediate thought when I hear about it, someone wanting to bring in a python, is like, can't you get that same effect from a cat, petting a cat, taking care of a cat? But you don't want to get yourself in the head of that student and their particular needs, and it's not for me to cast judgment. When it comes to the assignments side of things, so for service animals, you work with the student to find out what's going to be best to serve all of their needs. The students who I have on my campus who have service animals run from everything from complete mobility constraints and they're in a wheelchair to a student with diabetes who has a dog, the service dog, that alerts her when her sugar levels get too low. And so based on each individual need, that accommodation and where it's going to work best in our system is going to look different. And really, some of the same process works for the assistance animals as well. You work with the student to figure out the best location for them based on their need. And again, Josh brought up living learning communities. If you have those and a student wants to participate in that, it's important that you're working with them to accommodate that. You cannot require a student to live in a specific area because they have an animal. And I want to reiterate that very clearly, because one of the conversations I hear frequently that concerns me quite a bit is colleagues saying that they are creating a specific hall where students who have animals can live with their animals. You cannot do that. That's what we call steering. That's going to lead you into a whole world of other civil rights and other issues. You cannot create a community specific for these students. And you can't force students to live in any particular community because they've got this animal. So please keep that in mind regardless of, oh, go ahead, Josh.
I was just going to say, that's a different conversation than if you are just electively allowing animals as pets. So we want to be clear that this is talking about service and assistance animals. There are pet halls out there, and that's acceptable.
And that's actually one of the conversations that I'm hearing more often as well is, would it be easier if we just allowed pets in particular buildings? And say what you will about that, that might be an easier solution. We'll talk about deposits and financial accountability in a couple of slides, but that's certainly a way to handle that potentially. But it is important to keep in mind you cannot require a student to live in a specific area because of that animal. You also can't require a student with an assistance animal to move because roommates or floor mates have a fear of that animal. And that was one of the big challenges that we faced on our campus when this python came into campus, because that was the first time we had an assistance animal that, quite honestly, wasn't cute, wasn't something that a lot of people liked. Our executive director has a big fear of snakes, and so anytime I mentioned this python, he would start twitching. And it's just one of those things where it's uncomfortable. That doesn't matter. You can't make a policy decision based on your comfortable level with it. So, considerations that need to be brought in mind with these animals is, when you're talking about service animals, and really with any animal request coming in, communication is so important. Be in constant communication with your disability services staff. I meet every other week with staff representatives from our disability services office, even regardless of if we have any upcoming cases, but mostly just to make sure we've got that strong connection and we have really good communication and talk through, what's coming up on our campus, what are we hearing, what are we seeing. But I know that through those strong relationships with our disability services staff, they're going to advocate for our office very well. I'm very fortunate to have a very strong relationship with our disability services staff, and they have taken on the request for an assistance animal as part of their accommodation process. Now, keep in mind, the assistance animals are covered under the Fair Housing Act. This is the only reason that our disability services office would take that on. It's not something that they would necessarily have to do in regards to what's in their wheelhouse. The Fair Housing Act does not apply to them. But because we have made it part of a comprehensive accommodation process on our campus, they have been willing to take that part on, which is incredibly important and helpful. I'm also in constant communication with our general counsel office as new policies come up, as we see court cases coming up, or as an example with the Python that came this fall. We had a number of meetings with our general counsel about how we were going to make this work, how we were going to best approach that, and how we were going to communicate with both students and other students on the hall. As one of the things that is very interesting and an interesting dynamic for an assistance animal is you cannot disclose to multiple people the fact that this animal exists. So I'm able to disclose to roommates and suite mates that there's going to be an animal, but I can't tell the people in the room next door why there's an animal. So, and I'll get into that in another slide or two, but that's one of the elements that's it's an unusual dynamic that makes it honestly very challenging for our residential education staff to manage. So I'm going to get into the checklist that we've developed on our campus here at Oregon State that we go over with any student who brings an animal to campus. So student moves on campus, they've either got a service animal that they brought or they've got an approved assistance animal. Set up a meeting with them, and in that meeting is myself, the resident director for that building, someone from our residential education leadership team, and then the student has the option of having someone from our disability services office attend if they would like. And one of the reasons for that is we don't want to set up a dynamic where it's potentially 3 against 1. We want to make sure that they've got support and feel like they have an ally in the room if they want one. So here's some snapshots of this checklist that we do. If anybody would like a copy, I'd be happy to send it to you afterwards as well. So we go over the information, we get the students' information in there. We get a general description of the animal. I don't require them to give us a picture of it. We want a description of it. And then we require them to have veterinary name and phone number. An issue that we've had on our campus that it was one was like, I haven't experienced that before. We had a student whose parent was working as the veterinarian of record for the animal. And the thing about that is it was the parent wasn't a licensed veterinarian, which means that we could not legally accept that as an option. And again, that was one of those questions where it came up and I had to talk to our general counsel's office of, will this work? Was able to tell that student, sorry, no, you need to get a licensed veterinarian to be on record for this animal. And then, so then what we do is we go through a number of just different general guidelines for care for the animal, and the student initials it as they go through it. So I'm just going to go over a couple of things on this list. The first one there is animal can't pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others, right? That's pretty important, and that's one of the very few areas in which you can dispel or remove an assistance animal from your residences. So again, going back to that Python, there's a difference between perception of threat and direct threat, okay? So a lot of people perceive threats from snakes, myself included. I am not a fan, but unless that snake is actively hurting someone else, there's nothing we can do to remove it from our system. So if that changes, we have legal recourse to expunge the animal from our system. But at this point, we can't say we don't like snakes, so we can't allow you to have that. Animals must be housebroken, and that a lot of these guidelines here are going to look very different depending on what the animal is. So with the Python we had on campus, we also had a student bringing in a hamster. Those conversations look very different in terms of care for the animal. The resident must have effective control over the animal at all times. And again, that looks different. Dogs must be on a leash. I don't know how many of you have a cat, but if I were to try and put a leash on my cat, there would be hell to pay. So you need to prove that you are under control of that animal the whole time, or have control of that animal. Routine care for the animal is expected for health and safety reasons, and that includes everything from flea and tick and normal vaccinations for that animal. But it also making sure that you are taking care of the animal. I talked to a colleague at a different institution back on the East Coast who had to actually get rid of an animal on their campus because the student wasn't taking care of it, wasn't feeding it often, wasn't letting it out to go to the bathroom, and the animal was getting sick. So it was truly awful to hear about this and this poor condition of the animal. We also make sure that it's clear that any care of the animal and the costs associated with that are all the responsibility of the resident. That is not something that we will take on responsibility for. And another thing too is the animal can't be left in the care of other residents if the resident is away. So again, with an assistance animal, that animal is not going to class with the student. It's staying in their room. That doesn't mean that the student can just go away for the weekend and leave the animal alone or in the care of another person. They have an approved assistance animal that is providing needs of ameliorating symptoms of a particular disability. If you are constantly separated from that animal for more than 24, 48 hours, that nexus of the relationship there, you're not really showing that there's a need for that animal. So the next thing we talk about too is if, again, neglect is suspected, we're going to contact the resident. We also have the Oregon State Police on our campus, so we will contact them, and really it becomes about the health and safety of that animal and making sure that it's cared for. Another conversation that we have, and this is often one of the first times that a student will think about this, is based on the type of animal that they have, what do the student, what do staff for housing and dining agree to in terms of the amount of time the animal can be left alone in the unit. So if you've got a cat, they can be left alone for 8, 9, 10 hours a day and just be fine. Dogs are going to need to be let out to go to the bathroom. We are a Research 1 institution here, so we've got students who are often in labs for very long times during the day. And this conversation is one of the first times they think about, gosh, if I'm going to be gone for 6 hours, is that going to be, am I going to be able to take care of my dog or whatnot? So we have them put that information down there in terms of when someone's going to come or when they're going to be back to take care of the animal. We also require that the animal have a tag with the name of the animal on it and a contact number for the student, just in case it gets out. And again, this looks a little bit different. It's hard to put a tag on a hamster, as an example. But the reason we want the name of the animal and not the name of the resident is we need to make sure that we are not disclosing someone's private information. And again, that's one of the reasons why we can't tell other people on a floor that there's an assistance animal, because that would be violating both the FERPA rights, so the educational rights of the student, as well as it would violate their HIPAA, which is the Medical Protection Act. So we want to make sure that the name of the animal is on it and then a phone number for the student. And then we also require that since the assistance animals don't go to class with our students at this point, that it's recorded or some otherwise contained within the unit while the student's gone. I'm going to quickly go through some of the other ones here so we can leave some time for questions at the end here as well. So part of the conversation that we have with the student, it talks about the interaction with both roommates and the community. And again, this is oftentimes the first time the student has really thought through, especially if it's an assistance animal, how they're going to interact with that animal and their community. And that's where we talk about things like, so we're not going to tell people in your building, on your floor, on your wing, that you have an assistance animal. You're going to get questions from them about this animal. How are you going to handle that? What are you going to say? We usually help them brainstorm some tips and techniques for handling those conversations. Also make sure it's very clear that if a student finds out that if other students find out that that particular resident has an animal, it's not going to be because the housing staff told them. We also make sure that they know that that roommates will be notified about the presence of the animal. I've been fortunate at this point where students who have animals in rooms where they also have roommates, that student has been fairly proactive in informing roommates. I haven't had to surprise any roommates at this point about the presence of an animal, but I know it's just a matter of time before that happens. We also give students the option to be present if they are requesting maintenance for the room. We also request that they indicate in that maintenance request form itself that they've got an animal in the room. And that's been one of the interesting things that we've had to work through on our campus as well, is how do we make sure that our facilities staff, so the staff who are in the buildings and fixing concerns and issues, are aware of what's an approved animal and what is not. There was conversations at first about, well, do we put a sticker on the door if a student has an assistance animal? Well, we can't do that because that goes back to disclosing information that's federally protected about someone having an animal, and the reasons why people would have an animal is because they have a disability. So we're working on putting together a decal that can be removed annually that would go on the inside of a room. So it wouldn't be on the outside in the hallway where people could see it, but it would be inside the room. So it could be a good visual cue for our staff of, okay, this is an approved animal. I also make sure that all of our staff know when there's an approved animal in the buildings. I have questions almost daily from our resident director staff of, hey, my RA's heard that there was a kitty in this room, or there was, a rat found in this room. Well, I promise you, if there's an approved animal in your building, you will know about it. if you see an animal that's in the building and it has not been approved or you've not heard from me about it, it is not approved. So that's kind of one of the conversations that's ongoing in our office. And then we make sure that they know that the student is financially responsible for any damage done by the animal. So we can't require any sort of deposit or any upfront payment or additional payments for someone with an animal that's outside of the regular rent for the rooms. But we can hold them responsible for any damage, just like we would for any other student who damages items in the room. And then we just talk about how if they need to, worst case scenario, if we have to reassign them, we reserve that right. And that's language that's actually drawn right from our contract, is we reserve the right to reassign students at any time if need be. And then finally, we have the student sign it. The resident director signs it, and then I sign it myself, and we put it on the student's file within our system. So we track that we've got that form. So some of the common themes through creating these policies on our campuses, having something like a checklist or a guidance list like that on our campus, the biggest piece of advice that I can provide is that we take the time to be proactive instead of reactive. And again, thinking about the policies, have we created a process that's so cumbersome that no student can successfully navigate it? But hey, at least we don't have any animals on our campus. Or are we really seeking to understand what's going to be helpful to the benefit of that student? You know, the student has a significant need. This animal helps them be successful on our campus and will hopefully help them be successful towards graduation and matriculation, right? Isn't that kind of why we're here? And part of that understanding and being proactive is truly understanding what we can and cannot or should ask. And that goes back to training. I do training. I did training at the beginning of the year with our RA staff. I've done training with our dining staff. I make sure that I'm out there training all of our staff on the nuances involved with service and assistance animals. One of the things that colleagues who have gone through some of those lawsuits or have had some of these claims brought against them, oftentimes they're required as a department to have every staff member go through a very rigorous training and understanding of animals. So one of the things that we're doing again on our campus is being proactive in making sure that we're ahead of all of that and we're guiding the conversation in terms of that training. From what I understand, some of the trainings that people have been required to go through have been rigorous, long, and intensive. And then again, really just understanding and planning for the impacts of animals and residents. We have lots of conversation about, we have most of our residence halls are traditional style, which means they've got shared air. What does that mean if we've got students with allergies next to students with cats? How does that impact the community? How do we handle working with both of those students? Are we making sure that we're cleaning floors? Thankfully, for the most part, most of our rooms have no carpet, but if there's carpet and there's been an animal, how do we make sure that it's cleaned? All of these are really important questions to have and conversations to have on our campuses. So with that, I think we have covered all of the content that we had for you today. Have our contact information here if you've got more questions. In terms of those pictures on there really quickly, so the top picture is one of the service dogs. One of our resident directors has a service dog, and that's him there. His name is Wild. And then for those who don't know me, I love sloths. So if I'm going to have an assistance animal ever, it will probably be a sloth. So that's why I put that picture there. So, any questions? Or comments or experiences that you've had with animals on your campus? I suppose it's possible we covered everything.
We've just given people so much to think about that, got to ponder it in a reflective silence. So we really appreciate your participation today. As Kathryn mentioned, feel free to contact us offline if you have any directed questions or anything like that. And I believe this webinar will be posted online at some point soon. Today even, I'm being told. So with that, thanks for your participation. And I would be remiss if I didn't comment that we have an exciting Northwest ACUHO annual conference coming up in February in beautiful Anchorage, Alaska. And Kathryn, do you want to speak to that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. So right now we've got our registration, or early registration is still active for our conference in February up in Alaska. We have a lot of information on our website as well, and so we would love to see you in Alaska and have you join us there. And Josh put the website link there. There's also important links down in the lower right of the webinar itself, and it just changed the screen magically for you. Feel free, again, to let us know if you have any questions. If not, have a wonderful Friday and great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.